Hey everybody, welcome to another lesson of learning Japanese. In our previous lesson, we were of course continuing off of our coverage of the passive form in the Japanese language. And what we were covering specifically was the adversity passive form, which is one of two versions of the passive form in Japanese, and it's considered the more complicated one, so we had to split it into two categories in and of itself. So the first category was of course using the adversity passive form with transitive verbs, which was exactly what the last video was. And now in this lesson, we're now going to move on and cover the other category of the second version of the passive form, and that is going to be using the adversity passive form with intransitive verbs. So just to rehash a little bit of information that was already covered in the previous lesson but is still relevant right now, when we use the adversity passive form with transitive verbs, then the subject of the sentence is going to be this entity that is ultimately affected by the action that is performed by a separate entity, but that action is going to be a transitive verb in that it kind of involves another object. So the entity isn't performing the action unto itself, it's performing the action transitively to something else. But now we're covering the adversity passive form with intransitive verbs. So that means the subject of the sentence now is still going to be adversely affected by an action, and that action is still going to be performed by a separate entity other than the subject, but the action that is performed, the verb, it's going to be an intransitive action, as in that entity is performing the action onto itself, yet the subject of the sentence is still being affected by that somehow. So that might be a little bit confusing. You might be asking, if somebody's just doing something to himself, how can I, a person completely separate from him, be affected by his actions? Well, it's actually a lot more simple than it might seem. For example, if we were talking about the rain and the rain rains, it falls, that's an intransitive verb. It's doing something that isn't transitively affecting something else, it's falling. That's something that's happening to itself, the rain. Yet, as people who are very liable to weather conditions, we are going to be affected by a rainy day. So there you go, that's an intransitive verb. The rain's doing something by itself, but we're being affected still. Another example, if somebody dies, then that's something that's happening to him or her, but as is usually the case, there's going to be people quite intimate with that person who are ultimately going to be affected emotionally by his or her death. One more example, if somebody sneezes, that's something that's happening to him, but if he sneezes in a room that you're in, you might be negatively affected by that and get sick. So that might give you a loose idea of what the structure of this adversity passive form with intransitive verb works and why you would actually need it to say anything, to express anything. Now let's jump into some more concrete examples, and the examples we're going to use are exactly the ones I just stated, but in more detail. So for our first example sentence, we have the very simple line, Kino ame ni furareta. And this is a very interesting sentence because it can be easily misconstrued. If we translate the sentence, it's going to come out as something along the lines of, I was adversely affected by the rain falling yesterday, or much more naturally, I got caught in the rain yesterday, or I got rained on yesterday. We can see here that in all of the translations I just provided, there's kind of an emphasis on the unfortunateness of the rain falling on me, the subject, the speaker of the sentence. And that should give a good idea of exactly what this grammar pattern is used for when we're expressing that the subject of the sentence is affected by an action quite adversely. So let's break down the sentence bit by bit now. First up, we have kino, which is going to be yesterday. We have the noun ame, and ame is going to be rain. And here we know that it's not the subject of the sentence because it is succeeded by the particle ni and not the particle wa or ga. And so since this is the adversity passive form, we're now going to know that the rain is going to be the thing that performed the action, but not the subject of the sentence that is adversely affected by the action. And with that knowledge, then we can assume that the subject of the sentence is implied, and it's implied to be none other than the speaker, which is me. And now all we really need in the sentence is the verb to tell us what happened, and that's exactly all that's left. We have the verb furu, which means to fall. It's going to be in its passive form, in its plain past passive form, furareta. And so that's going to translate basically to was rained. Just taking what's provided in the sentence bluntly, kino ame ni furareta, if we translate just those words, we have quite confusingly, yesterday from rain was falled or was rained. But when we insert the implied subject of the sentence, which is the speaker, me, then we can see that it translates much more fluidly to, yesterday I was rained upon by the rain. Then we can further naturalize that to just, I was caught in the rain yesterday. For our next example sentence, we have another quite simple line, and that line is, Kino watashi no neko ni shinareta. And what this line is going to translate to is basically, yesterday I was adversely affected by my cat dying. Or maybe more naturally, we can just say, yesterday my cat died on me. So let's break down this sentence bit by bit. First up again, we have just the word kino, which means yesterday, to indicate the past. Right after that, we have watashi no neko, and this is going to be the noun of a noun modification. It's going to be watashi as me or I. And then we have neko as the word cat, so my cat basically. But watashi no neko isn't going to be the subject of the sentence, it's going to be the thing that performed the action, so we're going to mark that with a ni instead of a wa or a ga, and thus we know that the subject of the sentence is instead going to be the speaker of the sentence, implied as me or I. And now we move on once again to the only thing we need now. It's going to be the verb, the action that happened, and it's going to be the verb shinu, which means to die. We're going to change that to the passive plain past form, and so shinu turns into shinareta. And so if we put all of these parts together and we add a little naturalness to it, we get the line, yesterday my cat died on me, or yesterday I was adversely affected by my cat dying. For our last example sentence, we have the line, 教室でジョージ・ワシントンは隣の人にくしゃみされて病気になった。And what this relatively long sentence is going to translate to is basically, George Washington was adversely affected by the person next to him in class sneezing and got sick. So let's break this sentence down bit by bit. First up, we have 教室で, and 教室 is going to be the word for classroom basically. We're going to mark it with the particle de because it's going to be the location in which an action happened. Next up, we have the subject of the sentence. It's going to be George Washington. Then we mark him with the wa to make him the subject of the topic of the sentence. Now we're going to provide the entity that performed the action that George Washington is affected by. So we have tonari no hito, and tonari is going to translate to something along the lines of next to or neighbor. And so we're going to use the noun of a noun modification. We're going to use tonari and we're going to use the word hito, which means person. So tonari no hito is going to be basically the person next to him. Then we mark that with a ni because, like I just said earlier, this is going to be the person who performed the action that the subject of the sentence was adversely affected by. So we mark them with a ni. And now we provide the action, the verb that happened, and that's going to be kushami suru, and that's just going to basically translate to sneeze. But we're going to change this into the passive, so kushami suru, this is a verbal noun, so all we do is modify the suru that is used after the noun, and so suru turns into its passive form, and suru is one of the irregular passive form verbs, so suru turns into sareru. But since we're adding another clause to the sentence, we're going to additionally change the passive form sareru into its te form, so sareru turns into sarete. And so this te form is basically going to translate to and, so it lets us connect this clause with another clause. And our second clause is the much more simpler one, which is just going to be byoki ni natta. And byoki ni natta means basically got sick. Byoki is going to translate to sickness or sick. Then we're going to use the grammar construct blank ni naru to basically mean becomes that blank. Because naru is the verb that means to become, then the ni, and the ni there is basically going to be the particle that represents in what direction you went to become blank, kind of. And then of course we're going to conjugate naru into its plain past form, so naru turns into natta. So all together, once again, 教室でジョージ・ワシントンは隣の人にくしゃみされて病気になった is going to translate to basically George Washington was adversely affected by the person next to him in class sneezing and got sick. And so there you have it. Those are a couple examples of using the adversity passive form with intransitive verbs in which the subject of the sentence is affected adversely by another entity performing an action unto itself. And so with this also completes our coverage of the adversity passive form in general. We now know how to use the adversity passive form with both transitive verbs and intransitive verbs. And so do remember the nuance that the adversity passive form carries. It's going to be expressing something that happened to the subject of the sentence, and it's always going to be kind of a negative tone, as in the subject was literally adversely affected, as in, so there should be kind of a sympathy evoked. And what we're going to do in the future is we're going to cover a certain grammar pattern that expresses kind of the opposite of this, in which the subject is positively affected by another entity performing an action. And again, we haven't covered this grammar pattern yet, but in the future we will. It's going to be the te form of a verb basically, plus the additional verb moral, which basically means to give. And so this is going to be kind of the opposite of what we covered in this video and the last video. It's going to again express a positivity in someone being affected by someone else's actions, while the adversity passive form expresses a negative influence. So basically just be prepared to interpret these two grammar patterns once we know both of them as contrasts.